Good morning. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, July 14th, the fifth day of Av. We're studying the Talmud, presently Maseches Shabbos, chapter 6, and we are at the tail end of 62b. Perhaps we'll turn the page to 63a. Today, the 5th of Av, before we start, I should mention, is the yahrzeit of one of the most influential Jewish people of all times. I'm referring to the yahrzeit of the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who certainly is credited for the most recent, and I mean 500-year-long wave of Kabbalistic teachings and development in the Jewish world. Most Kabbalists today get their Kabbalistic teachings from the teachings that were conveyed to us through the students of the Arizal. And so forth. A very instrumental, influential person. He lived a very short time. He passed away at a very young age. And so much of Jewish practice today is influenced and informed by him one way or another. One of the three most prevalent scripts for the Torah is called the Ksav Arizal, which is a Kabbalistically informed script that many Torahs that you may have experienced are read from. Including at least one in our shul, is the Arizal's Ksav. The Arizal also famously informed a good percentage of the Jewish population's prayer text or nusach. The Arizal also has the distinction of being someone that bridged the gap between Sepharad and Ashkenaz Jews that originally originated from Spain, and then actually he was from a family that was exiled from Spain after the expulsion in 1492, and many Jews moved to Tzfat. Many Jews moved all over. Many Jews had nowhere to go, but his father was Ashkenazic, and his mother was Sephardic. And so I think his childhood he was born or grew up in Jerusalem in an Ashkenazic community, if I'm not mistaken. But his father passed away, and then he moved with his mother to Alexandria, to Egypt, where he was deeply exposed to the Sephardic community and to the Kabbalistic teachers that were more prevalent in Egypt in the Sephardic community. Anyways, there's a lot more about his biography, and Zechusa Yagin Aleinu, his merit, his memory and his merit should be a protection for all of Klal Yisrael. And on this day, we'll dedicate learning to the Zechus of the Arizal, as well as, of course, the memory of all those that were taken from us in Surfside, and in particular, the Ainsworth family that lived in our block until just a few months ago. The Neshamas should have an Aliyah. And then, of course, we'll mention Mazal Bat Esther, Yosef's sister, who unfortunately just passed away. We'll dedicate learning to her as well. And now let us get onto the Gemara. You probably don't remember what we discussed yesterday. But in the closing segment, we discussed three behaviors that might be a trigger for poverty. One of them had to do with urinating near the bed. Number two, we said, who remembers? Number two, we said,
wife cursing you publicly.
No, that was the third one, but what was the second one?
The second one was not washing, not being meticulous in the Tilas Yadayim.
Shkoyach, doctor. Yes. So number one was what we just mentioned. Number two was not being particular to wash Netilas Yadayim, and number three, we said if one's wife is compelled to lash out because you're being cheap and you're not honoring her appropriately and sufficiently. And then the Gemara explains that it's describing particularly that one should if they have the means, they should provide their wife with jewelry and presents. And
because of that, my wife encouraged me to get on time today and not to be late and not to miss a word.
Indeed. And so we actually found explanations. We said that a person that lives a sloppy, messy, and smelly environment, nikayon, cleanliness, seder, organization, is part of it creates an environment that's conducive to Kedusha, to holiness, and to Hashem's bracha. We said washing one's hands generously. We didn't use the word segula, but it could lead to a blessing for an abundance of parnasa. Failure to do so would be missing out on that great opportunity, says the Gemara. And then, of course, this was more my inference, but many times a person's bracha is on account of their spouse. And so if you don't take care of your spouse and make sure that they're happy, well, then that might not bode well for your financial prosperity. But if you recall more broadly, we introduced the discussion because we're talking about balsam oil and balsam herbs that provide a pleasant smell. And we found a verse in Amos and the prophets that was critical of the Jewish elite, that were blind to the spiritual needs and the impending doom of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And instead of that, they would anoint themselves with oil and party. And the Gemara asked what exactly was so wrong with doing those things. And we said that really they were doing much more inappropriate orgies and swinging parties, as I think the Gemara explained quite graphically. The Gemara is now going to continue along these lines, describing presenting and explaining other verses in the Torah that are critical of the Jewish people in the era that preceded the Churban Beis Hamikdash. And of course, everything Hashem is b'hashgacha pratis, and so we're going to be reading some more about themes that are at least loosely connected to the period reign of the 9 days and the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Sit back, relax, and but you may want to plug in your headphones if your wife thinks we're going to be talking about more presents. There might be other themes as well. Rebel, I see you're saying something, but you're muted.
Okay.
They bounced us out of our Gemara, so we'll be back in a moment. Here we go. (62b). It's a pretty long page, and let's go to where we are up to. All right. I want to remind you that the Torah does not always feel compelled to be entirely in accordance to the most current politically correct perspective. And so let's just put that as what's the word? Anyways, let's put that out there from that outset. Dorish Rabba Brei Rabbi Eloi. Rabba Bar Eloi explained as follows. You mind explaining to me a verse that describes a prophet's criticism of the Jewish people from Yeshaya 3:16? Let's see the verse. Vayomer Hashem says, Yan ki gavo b'nai Tzion, because the daughters of Zion have become haughty. Now, I want to say, many times b'nai Tzion does not mean the women. Many times it could be a reference to all of the Jewish people. This Rava, Brei Rabbi Eloi, is going to read this as a text that is critical of the women. I have news for you. Study some prophets. Study from Isaiah. I think a bulk of the criticism is reserved for the men. But this happens to be, we're currently analyzing a text that is critical of the women of Jerusalem. What were they doing wrong? Shehayu, did I let Alan in? Yes. Shehayu mehalchos b'koyma zekufa, they would walk around with an upright stature, which is not saying that they had a good posture. It's saying that they presented and they strutted in a certain haughty manner. We'll explain some more in a moment, so we'll just hold that thought. They walked around with their necks stuck out, which means shahayu mahalchos akev b'tzad gudal. They walked in a certain slow and suggestive manner. That's my interpretation based on the commentaries and the Gemara's further discussion. Mishakroi seinayim, their eyes, wanton eyes. They have a malyon kuchla leinayu miramzim. They would make up their eyes and they would hint to the people they would see about untoward behavior. Haloch v'tafov, they would go And let's see Rashi for this word. It's a funny word. You can see your Stein's up with. They would walk and mincing. The Gemara is going to explain what this tafel is. Arucha bitzad kitzar. They had a certain distinct gait. Let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz. They would walk and mince as they go. They would have oh, interesting. I would not have understood that to be there. All right. The tall women would ask a short person to go with them so that they would be able to draw attention to themselves. Again, I'm not sure if all these things would be, I'm not sure if one would be comfortable making such criticism in 2021, but let's see some more and then we'll discuss it. And they would make a tinkling with their feet. They place myrrh and balsam in their shoes. They'd walk around the markets of Jerusalem. When they'd come to the young men of Israel, they would do some kind of kicking motion to the ground. And they would spray perfume at them. And they would attempt to seduce these young men with this whole dance. So there's a lot of description of mannerisms, behavior that was done to be suggestive and to seduce others. I know today we say that you don't blame what the person's wearing, you blame the person that chooses to react, and that is certainly the case. However, the prophet here is critical of this immodest attempt to be seductive. And as the Gemara is going to explain in a moment, we're not talking about single people here, we're talking about married people, which makes matters worse and less appropriate. We could look at Rashi. What does it mean that they had their necks stuck out? They would walk in a specific gait that would maximize the attention drawn to them. And he says something interesting. When a person is looking upwards, they don't see what's in front of them, and so they slow down their pace. And maybe this might be described, Rebbetzin, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe this is like a, how do you call it, where people go on a catwalk. The Rebbetzin says a catwalk, or maybe some kind of...
In English, the word haughty means walking sort of...
No, haughty is gaiva.
Your nose high up in the air.
Right. But here we're translating it differently. When they say it's not just haughtiness, gaiva, but it was also a kind of mode of walking that would maximize attention. They would make up their eyes in a way that was beyond the conventional makeup for Jerusalem.
It's interesting. That's the word sheker there, no?
Yes. Umiramzin, we said that they would hint. What were they hinting? Es habachurim. They would try to wink and hint at the young men. Seeker lashon habata, and peek and stare. And anyways, that's what's going on over here. So again, there's a verse in Isaiah that describes the way the women were haughty, and the literal interpretation has nothing suggestive or seductive. The literal interpretation is talking about gaiva, and Rabbah Bar Eloi says we're talking about some attempt at seduction. So the Gemara says, again, I want to remind you, most of Isaiah is criticizing the men, so there's a lot of equal opportunity in the prophets. My pernasai, what would be a punishment for such a behavior? So for this, we're also going to refer to the same prophet Isaiah. Kididarish Rabba Bar Ula, we're going to follow the teaching of Rabba Bar Ula. The verse in Isaiah says, it'll pass that instead of a sweet smell, perfume, there shall be stench. The verse continues, and instead of a belt, a rope. Instead of a well-set hair, baldness. Instead of a fine dress, girding of sackcloth. Instead of beauty, a breath. And this is mostly meant to be allegorical. The glory of Jerusalem will be gone, and instead of riches and prosperity and influence, there'll be poverty and suffering and misery. That's the literal understanding. Well, I shouldn't say literal. That is the common understanding of this. Yehuda Bar Eloi has a different understanding, which is more immediate and, in a sense, more literal. How so? Makom shahaya mis basmos bo, the place where they would put their perfume, nasos nimakim nimakim, would become rotten. Tachis chagura nikva, instead of a belt, a rope. Makom shahayu chagura is betzilza, natsa and a kafim the kafim. Instead of their hair being in a beautiful braid, it would become, and this is just my guess, but based on reading, it sounds like they'll become like dreadlocks, which in the times of Isaiah and the Mishnah apparently was not considered nice. Tachas masa miksha karcha, instead of beautiful hair, baldness. Makim shem is tashleis by nasa krach and krach, where all of their adornments, the hair again would also be all knotty. Tachas sigil michagor sak, instead of the nice clothing, there'll be sackcloth. The body would be coarse and unpleasant. This is like what people say. Tragically, sometimes a person could have, instead of beauty, infection, irritation, and a sore. And so the first verse talks about a overindulgence in adornment, seduction, and what is perceived by the Tanakh and by the Mishnah and the Gemara as troublesome behavior, and all of those things are undone in the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Any comments?
The only comments I could see, the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. But we didn't read that yet. Hold on, we didn't read that yet. Okay.
We're about to talk about that.
All right.
All right.
Amen.
Amen.
The Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the heads of the daughters of Zion. And the verse continues, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. And that, by the way, is not yet what the Gemara is discussing. That's the rest of the verse. So the Gemara says, what does it mean that Hashem will scab the crown? These Jerusalem beauty contestants will be smitten with sardas. How do we see in the word sipach that there is a saras connotation? So now we're going to do some Hebrew language analysis. Sipacha v'sipach. It says, interesting, sipach. I don't know why there's a shin over there. But anyways, the word sipach, which means scab, is not that different from sipach. Let's say sapachas. The word sapachas is a type of leprosy. And so tragically, the Gemara continues to explain verses of the prophets that are prophesying, predicting the fall of Jerusalem and the misery that is to follow, and all of the glory, all of the beauty, all of the wonder, all of the prosperity is undone. And that's why we mourn in these days. Doctor, you were going to say something?
No, I think that Alan and Bernie are happy with this advertisement for the CPAC because they made a lot of money. CPAC, yeah.
I didn't even notice that CPAC. Maybe that's how we get restored. That's how we restore. We should sell this. We should forward this to CPAC. They could do something nice with this. All right. To restore the beauty and the prosperity of Israel, we need to have CPAC. All right. No, I'm mixing up. That's APAC. I'm sorry. What am I saying? APAC. I'm sorry.
Rebbe,
yes.
It's a very gloom prediction, and it would be easier to understand if the punishment was directed only at those women, not on children and the rest of the population of Jerusalem. Is there any message about responsibility of one Jew for another? How do we treat it? I mean, because of the sins of the part of the population, we see the whole population is punished, including tzaddikim and those people who weren't guilty. In the situation with other punishments, we saw this distinction, like Abraham asked for upright people to be spared, and the Jonas prophecy was directed against the total population, not to the part of the population. So how do we treat that relative to other examples of punishment, and what do we think about punishing the whole population for the sins of the part of the population?
So this is a big question. I'm certainly not gonna, I wouldn't do justice by trying to give an answer now, but I do recall, maybe someone else can help me out. We previously had this discussion in the Gemara, and at that place in the Gemara, it was probably 10 pages ago or so, a month or so ago. So it was more than 10 pages. And the Gemara initially says that there are good people being punished alongside the evil. And then the Gemara ends up being critical. Maybe you remember this. It talks about that they didn't protest. I'm not going to say that is the answer here, but it's a general question. Why does the whole of Jerusalem fall? Why does the whole of Israel fall if many people were righteous? And it appears that sometimes there's a critical mass of evil, or Hashem comes to a point, and in a time of praniyot, of punishment, sometimes even those that are not so evil can be swept along. Again, this is not to answer the question, really, just to add that it's a big discussion. The good news is that our Gemara here does not explicitly wade into that territory, except, Professor, that you are saying that the Gemara's present interpretation absolves us of getting into that issue. Because if the verse is talking about the devastation of the whole of Jerusalem, then we need to once again confront the question of why would good people be taken alongside the bad. Whereas our present interpretation, which is more focused to individual practices and their consequences, it allows us to focus more on the individual. So, shkoyach, Professor, for the comments, and I'm sorry for punting on that one. All right, let's see some more of the Gemara. All right, Rabbi Allen, are you ready?
I'm ready. I wanted to ask a question.
Okay, go ahead. Before you ask your question, you notice the verse and you ask the question. After your question, we'll see how the Gemara explains that. So go ahead.
It says that the Lord will lay their
we didn't discuss it yet. That's what we're going to discuss now.
Okay.
You didn't read it. And what I was telling you is that you noticed this verse previously, and now is the moment we're going to read it. I'm going to read this.
Okay. All right.
I'm going to read the verse. I'm going to read Rabbi Steinsaltz's English without commentary. And Hashem pashen ya'ara. Hashem will lay bare their secret places. Rabbi Shmuel. There are two interpretations. Chad Amar shenisbuchu kikitoin. Chad Amar shenasu peschein kiyar. Let me read the English, and I'm going to read it without commentary. The Lord will lay bare their secret places. Rabbi and Shmuel disagree. One says it means their innards poured out like a jug. And one says that their orifices were covered with hair thick as the forest. Rashi explains that both of these potential interpretations meant that they were nismalu v'nimasas l'sashmish. They were considered repulsive to their partners. Rabbi Allen, do you have any comments or additional thoughts that we should share in this segment?
No, the only thing I was thinking of is that one of the negative commandments is that you should not bare your private parts, or a man shouldn't look at a woman's private parts, or a father shouldn't look at his daughter's private parts.
Yeah, generally Judaism is into modesty and against exposing of oneself in an immodest manner. Here we're not talking about a person, we're talking about a certain shame. And so revealing here just as a euphemism for shame and disgust associated with their bodies. And again, all of this has a lot of unpacking, and there's certainly contextualizing and understanding and appreciating in the light of how things are commonly explained or understood. today would be an extensive work. And for that reason, I've chosen to read this without commentary, so we can all make of it as we see fit. But certainly, this is not a call to immodesty or uncovering of oneself. This is talking about the utter shame. Actually, let me say this. And throughout the book of Eicha, Lamentations, there's constant reference to being exposed, and it's describing the degree of shame, because people of dignity don't want to be exposed, and so they went from being on a very high, living the high life, and cast into the streets and bereft of everything, and maybe not even having proper clothing, and so that's not considered a positive; it's considered a true negative. Now, I do need to make a slight interruption here and make an advertisement. Anyone that follows Israeli news, or I should say English language news from Israel, may have come across a fascinating press release that was put out by Ir David, the city of David, where they've recently uncovered a wall which they understand or claim to be part of the original city walls of Jerusalem during the time of the first Beis Hamikdash. And although the prophets describe how the whole Beis Hamikdash was razed to the ground, and the city walls were razed to the ground, and the houses of the elites were razed to the ground, they theorize that, generally speaking, the wall was torn down, but segments did remain. And they recently put out a video and a press release, there's news coverage all about these walls from the fall of the first Beis Hamikdash. Alongside with that discovery, they also spoke of another bula, which is one of those imprints of the signets that we've been talking about. And I forget, it was a biblical era Jewish name. Safan, maybe, I don't remember exactly what the name was. And they also found indications of burning and devastation connected to the burning of Jerusalem. And so I don't know if they just discovered it or they hold on to these things to release them when it's like, time of year, but certainly a fascinating discovery. And if you haven't seen this, I would definitely encourage going to Times of Israel or any other, probably Yediot or whatever. I'm sure that all of them have.
Also, story in Jerusalem Post with pictures.
Jerusalem Post. And if you want to get a more Hamish place, you can go to the Jewish Press. I think everyone's talking about it. And so
Hamodia has a little.
Hamodia, yes. So it's big news. It's big news. Anyways, but I thought it was appropriate to mention now as we talk of the Churban and the devastation and the pain of that moment. Let's continue. Continuing in the Gemara's reading of readings of the prophets, and giving its own special interpretation and explanation. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda quotes Rav as follows: Anshe Yerushalayim, Anshe Shachat Hayu. The folks of Jerusalem were incredibly arrogant. Rashi, Midabrim Beloshen Gaiva Ulage Sofa. They were haughty and they were dumb and crude. How so? Adam Omer Lechaverei. A man would ask his friend, what was on the menu today? What did you dine to? Bipas Amila, Bipas She'ena Amila. Was it kneaded bread or not well kneaded bread? V'yayin gurdoli oy v'yayin chardoli. Was it white wine or black wine? And Rashi explains, I guess we're supposed to understand this on our own. I didn't. When they were asking what they had for lunch, they were really asking about their intimate life. And Pasamila was talking about a married woman, or She'ena Mila, not needed, was a virgin. Wine was describing the complexion of the individual that they were intimate with. The Meis Abrachav was your tabletop, wide or narrow. The Chaver Toiv, did you have your lunch with a good friend, a Bechavera with a bad friend? Amar Achista v'chul leznos. These were all allusions to the promiscuous culture of the folks at that time. Certainly no indication that they were living monogamous lifestyles, and of course a strong criticism of those people. And so Rav understands, or Rav was teaching, or Yehuda was conveying, that the upper elites of Jerusalem were really living depraved, immoral lifestyle. I should point out, one of the challenges that a Jew who studies the Bible and the Mishnah and the Gemara has when they follow archaeological finds and news, and I remember having this question when I was in Israel and we went to Ir David, and they told us how they found statues and Avodah Zarah in Yerushalayim. And I was thinking, so does that mean that Jerusalem, that they didn't worship, they weren't Jewish, they didn't have the Torah? But of course, if you read the prophets properly, you realize that a lot of the elites, who are the people that are living in these grand structures we are finding, really lived a life that was divorced from the values of the prophets and the values of the Torah. And they had Avodah Zarah, and they were living this kind of lifestyle. And it's this lifestyle that's connected to the Churban, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So it's worthwhile to keep that in mind, just to have the context when we read these kind of stories, or when we have these kind of archaeological finds. Oh, by the way, I should point out, we've turned to page 63a. That's Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, another wonderful milestone in our journey through the Shas, through Talmud. All right. So now we've concluded so they were arrogant and they were crass and they would inquire about each other's intimate life. And from the questions they would ask, it's clear that they were not living a life of fidelity and faithfulness to their spouses. The Gemara now continues on the topic of Yerushalayim, but not exactly the same graphic or horrific subjects that we've been reading about until now today. Amar Rechava, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rechava said, quoting Rabbi Yehuda, Atze Yerushalayim shel kinamon hayu. You know, the wood that the people of Yerushalayim would use, and Rabbi Steindl says for fuel, was cinnamon. Ubisha shahayu masikin mehem, and when they would light their furnace, their fireplace, Reicha noide b'chol Eretz Yisrael, the whole land of Israel became full of this beautiful fragrance. Umeshachar of Yerushalayim, but then when Yerushalayim was destroyed, Nignizu, all that wood was lost. Only a little sliver of that wood was remaining. And it was located in the treasury of Simsameh, the queen. And so basically all this wonderful wood that made Jerusalem such a wonderful place to live. And Dr. Hammer, this brings to mind your comments yesterday about how they would diffuse fragrance into the air and it would create an environment and it would affect people's moods. And so it seems like it's not only a modern development, but even back in those days, Jerusalem, they would attempt to diffuse and to place these kind of fragrances in the air, and it certainly created a wonderful environment. And tragically, that environment is no more with the fall of Jerusalem. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, we've finished to the Mishnah. We're going to go to a new Mishnah. Before we go on, I want to quote Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who is quoted here in Rabbi Steinsaltz's Gemara to say as follows. A point I tried making, but he makes it clear. Why does the Gemara add in this story about the conversation that the men of Jerusalem would have? Where does it come in? Why does it connect to our Gemara? So Yaakov Emden says very simple. If we wouldn't add this in, you'd leave this Gemara thinking that the Gemara is only complaining about the women's misdeeds. But in truth, what do they say? It takes two to tango. And so all the folks, the men and the women of the elite of Yerushalayim, were equally guilty of this immoral, immodest culture. And so the Gemara makes sure to be equal opportunity or equal opportunity on the criticism of both the men and the women of Jerusalem.
So Rabbi, one more comment before we leave this Mishnah. I was fascinated by the discussion of washing of hands, which I imagine at that time was not a common occurrence And look at how many times, because of COVID, we've been told, wash your hands.
Indeed, indeed. Well, one of the things they say is that during the Black Plague, where, by the way, the Jews suffered a lot, but there were allegations that the Jewish people were spared of the Black Plague. And so there are a number of theories of why in certain areas the Jews may have been less affected. I think the old theory had to do with washing hands. I think the new theory has to do with Jewish burial practice, where a lot of times the illness was spread when they were not burying the corpse with the remains, the human remains of those that died of the plague. I think the Jews, in their value of burial, may have avoided some of those infections, although ultimately not entirely, because you live in a society and illness can spread regardless of your own personal hygienic practices. And but it's certainly interesting where Jewish washing of hands certainly must have contributed to some value besides for spiritual value. Dr. Hammer, you're muted, but we'd love to hear you.
But during COVID, Reb Beryl, and no place were we asked to wash with a bracha. And I think the important, it's a really important distinction, whether or not the bracha, saying the bracha, thinking about it, having kavana of what we're doing is as important or more important often than the washing of the hands. And the example I would go into would be at the Seder, we wash with a bracha at one point and without a bracha at another point. And I think, and there are reasons for that, but functionally, people act very differently because they're talking and they have to wash their hands. So I'm just saying, I think that it's a good point about it.
Oh, doctor, we lost you.
You might even say that you want to wash your hands to have an opportunity to make a bracha. Push it all the way.
That's what I'm not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting it's a very major difference in terms of the kavana and the mindset of somebody who's doing it with a bracha and without a bracha.
Interesting. And there's something else I remember. I forgot. I'm sure many a yeshiva rebbe makes the same point. But in New York, there's a prevalence of buying bread that's mezainis, and there's a question about how it's mezainis and if it's mezainis. They use fruit juice and exactly the definition in the halacha about pas haba v'kisnin. But forgetting that, many a yeshiva rebbe would tell a student who was eager to get their hands on a mezainis bread, would ask, why do you want a mezainis bread? It's because you want to avoid having to do bir chas hamazon. You want to avoid benching. But why would you want to avoid the wonderful opportunity to bench and to spend a few paragraphs praising Hashem? And so that might be a companion thought, doctor, to your comment about the kavanah that comes alongside making a bracha. So shkoyach for sharing that. Now I wanted to just take a peek here at the Ben Yehoyada, and then we'll start the next Mishnah. The Ben Yehoyada explains our discussion about the wood of Jerusalem being made out of cinnamon. What does that mean? Does it mean that all the trees of Jerusalem were cinnamon trees? By the way, what does a cinnamon tree look like? Have you ever seen a cinnamon tree? Let's see what Google has to offer. All right. Looks like cinnamon tree. That looks like a cinnamon tree. I guess the bark is stripped, and I guess that becomes the
piece of cinnamon.
All right. Listen, I'm a city boy. We don't have a lot of cinnamon trees in Brooklyn or Miami.
Comes out of a shaker.
Right. You buy it in the store.
Aisle 4 in the supermarket.
All right, let's see. There was so much cinnamon. Usually cinnamon was considered a high value item. You don't burn cinnamon. You sell it, you ship it off to, I don't know, wherever. You ship it off to Publix and Winn-Dixie and Walmart and wherever else people sell spices. Why would you burn it? There was such an abundance that they were able to burn it. Why would Hashem make such a miracle? that there should be so much cinnamon in Jerusalem. Laharois kin leinasan lahem es Eretz Yisrael ela b'shvil lasik b'Torah. Hashem wanted to telegraph a message that the whole reason the Jews got the land of Israel is to study Torah. Lokach asa b'sgula nifla da'avira machkim. Dr. Hammer, this is your point. Therefore, Hashem did a wonderful segula. Because environment, the aromas of the air can enhance your mind and your ability, your focus and concentration. Hashem ensured that there should be a pleasant scent in the environment. And in truth, the Gemara says a good smell can make a person wiser, activate some brain cells. Wine, pleasant aromas make you smarter. Why should it be cinnamon as opposed to many other wonderful fragrances? The aromas by kano man. The word cinnamon in Hebrew, kinaman, is like two words. Kanu, acquire, and man, which is a reference to the stuff that comes from heaven. And in the time where there was no manna, it means Torah. And so cinnamon is saying, get yourself some man, get yourself this gift of Torah that came from heaven. What does it mean that when Jerusalem was destroyed, the cinnamon disappeared? Hashem took away the inclination of the earth to generate and be conducive for cinnamon trees to grow wild. I imagine today, if you want to grow a cinnamon tree, you have to cultivate it and work hard. And it seems like Jerusalem naturally had these cinnamon plants growing. And Hashem preserved this ability to reactivate. When Mashiach comes, then Hashem will reactivate the land, and we might find a prevalence of cinnamon trees once again. What does it mean a little bit was left? A little bit of cinnamon remains, but not at all compared to the way it used to be. What's this place? The treasury of the Tzimtzami queen. It means it means that it's preserved like Tasha. Being that the Beis Hamikdash is burnt, as also Hashem Yisbarach, Kimasha Yetzel Yisrael, Bizol Shul L'Sreifas Eish L'Tzef Bishul, Kini Achta Achta Sreifas, Beis Hamikdash Yetzel L'Lachem L'Tiferet. So the price of cinnamon has shot up in a very considerable way after the fall of Yerushalayim. Until Jerusalem fell, cinnamon was a cheap and prevalent available substance in Yerushalayim to make sure the environment was pleasant and nice. But now it's once again gone back to becoming an elite item for very special people. So maybe, Reb Beryl, you might say that the prevalence of cinnamon in those shakers might be a clue that we're getting closer to the time that Mashiach will come. And so slowly, cinnamon becomes more available. And now I want to just say one more thing.
Rabbi, before you leave the cinnamon, I just looked on Google. Israeli archaeologists find a 3,000-year-old cinnamon trace.
Check that out. Wow. I was actually wondering if the archaeological record would support this at all. So there was cinnamon in Israel 3,000 years ago. That's incredible. So if someone were to ask you, or now we have a question, you might want to start off a shir. You say a Dvar Torah in your home on Shabbos connected to Mashiach, because we're going to mourn the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. You could say, do you know what the connection between cinnamon and Mashiach is? And I bet no one, even your rabbi, probably won't know the answer, or maybe they will if they learn this segment of the Gemara. And again, once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the cinnamon disappeared. When Mashiach comes, Hashem will reactivate, and Jerusalem will once again have pleasant fragrance. So you see, everything aligns, everything is precise, and so we were zocha to study this Gemara and this subject in these days in the 3 weeks. And now we've concluded we've concluded the third Mishnah of the 6th chapter of Masechet Shabbos, and after our Kohen Gadol's comments, we'll take a sneak peek at the Mishnah, which we will continue studying in depth tomorrow, Be'ezer Hashem. Alan, bevakasha.
I was just wondering if Tzimtzum, the Tzimtzum nail we see here is what the difference is between that and the Hebrew word for Tzimtzum, which God is reduced to, or God compresses.
There's a good chance that there could be a connection. I certainly can't rule it out. That's interesting. Let's see if any of the Kabbalists pick up on this word. Because that's where someone might make that connection. Oh, no. No. Let's just see. All right, copy that. Let's see, do it. Pre-tzaddik. Control find. All right, I'm not seeing anything over here. I'll ask my brother-in-law, who's an expert on the Tzimtzum. I'll ask him if there's any reference to this, but that'll have to be later. All right, let's see the new Mishnah, and then we'll call it a day. Lo yetze ha'ish, a man. So we spoke last Mishnah, as you may recall, especially the last part that I'm sure you recall about the balsam in the little package that they wore, or the flask, and other items that a woman mustn't wear out on Shabbos. Well, you know what? A man also has laws, rules about what you can and cannot wear on Shabbos. Lo yetze ha'ish, a person shouldn't go out wearing loy b'sayaf, they can't wear a sword. V'loy b'keshes, nor wear on their person or carry out a bow. V'loy b'sris, nor with a shield. V'loy ba'ala, nor with an Allah. Rashi tells us, the Gemara is going to explain. V'loy b'roimach, nor with a spear. V'im yatsa, if a person did go out on Shabbos with a sword, with a bow, with a shield, with an Allah to be defined, or with a spear, they would have to bring a sin offering for the desecration of Shabbos. The Mishnah continues. Rabbi Lazar disagrees and says, no way. What are you talking about? Tachshitin heim loy. Weapons are not just weapons. Weapons put together the person's look. And this is where we've referenced in the past, if you go to some kind of wedding of certain people of certain backgrounds and national origins, you might find them putting on their the traditional ceremonial garb from that country. And sometimes that might include daggers, swords. There are Jewish groups that have this, and I'm sure other ethnicities that do so as well.
Strimal.
Or a strimal, but that's another story. Do Bukharians have swords? No. Okay, but others. So Rabbi Lazar says, hold on, it makes the look. You don't wear a sword to use. It makes you look like a warrior class. It presents you and makes you look like a mensch. Chachamim say, no way. What are you talking about? How could a sword, a bow, how could it make you look good? Chachamim say, no way. Weaponry, that's shameful. Why? Because the ultimate value, the ultimate goal of all of these weapons is to get rid of them. The prophet describes in Isaiah 2:4 that they'll beat their swords into plowshares. And this is a famous verse. You know why? Where is this verse prominently displayed?
At the UN.
Prominently displayed at the UN. If only they would live up to all of their ideals, that would be another story. But
Hat man gesucht.
V'chani soisehem, and their spears, lambaz merois, to pruning hooks. V'lo yisa goy el goy cherev, and one nation shall not raise up against another nation a sword. V'lo yomadu od milchama, and they will no longer train for war. It comes from Yeshaya, but it's being quoted in the Mishnah. Rashi, v'chitzu charboisam, we're going to take our swords and turn it into plowshares. But if it's also has value as a adornment, then there's no reason why the prophet would call for their ultimate disappearance when Mashiach comes. So we have a machlokes. Can a sword complete your outfit? Rabbi Eliezer says yes. The Chachamim say no. All right, Rebel, you're muted. Oh, no, you're not talking to us. Okay, Biris. Now let's go back to the Ezra's Nashim, and let's see about women's clothing. Biris, Rashi says, will be explained in the Gemara. Tahira, it's pure. V'yotzim ba b'Shabbos, and you're allowed to wear it on Shabbos. Rabbi Steinsaltz translates with regards to women's ornaments. They added that a garter on the leg to hold up stocking is pure, and they can wear it on Shabbos. The purity has to do with the complex balance of what something is being used for. Is it a keli? Is it a vessel? It is a garment. Long story short, Rashi says that a person is not going to take off garments of clothing that are ultimately part of their modesty portfolio. Kavolim, ankle chains. Kavolim is typically describes what a person might have in prison to keep them in bounds. But apparently they could also have been ornamental. They are considered a vessel, and therefore they can become ritually impure, and for the purposes of Shabbos, they mustn't be worn out in the public, and the Gemara will elaborate. And so here we have a Mishnah which mostly lists items associated with weapons of war, but they can also be part of a person's look. Lemaisa, the Chachamim say they should not be worn on Shabbos, and if you do, it's considered a desecration of the Shabbos. And the Gemara is going to have a lot more to say on this subject. The Ezer Hashem. And this reminds me of how when I see Rabbi Miller, who works for the Chevra Kadisha, lives in Hallandale, we always wish him that he should go out of business, because the Chevra Kadisha will not be necessary when Mashiach comes. And so this Mishnah similarly makes the wish, or expresses the wish that's already conveyed in the prophets, that we should get rid of all weaponry and we should live in a time of a true peace. May it be speedily in our days. We'll see the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. Should be so ASAP. Tomorrow, Be'ezer Hashem, will start with the Gemara, and we can do the first line just for fun. Allah, what is this word Allah, which I said the Gemara will explain? Kulpa, it is a club. Rabbi Steinsaltz's etymology. Apparently here, because we have 1 minute left. Apparently the correct reading is kup, kupla, P before L. And this is a Persian club called a kupal. And indeed, the Gaonim describe it to be a stick that is sticking at one end with nails or other kinds of projections, not something you'd like to be at the wrong end of in combat. And Reb Allen, just because you asked, the Maharsha says that cinnamon that was found in the treasury of Simsimai. Some say the word simsim is a word for decoration, and it's describing how the queen would have in her wardrobe where she would adorn herself the cinnamon, and maybe it was meant to treat the clothing or something to that effect. Anyways, that's today's Gemara. Thank you for joining us. and I hope you'll join us tomorrow. Again, yesterday and today was a little bit of a detour, a little less halacha, a little more on the agada, sometimes straining our imagination. And I hope you found that interesting. And again, tomorrow we'll continue on with regular stuff. Bli neder, I'll send out a schedule on WhatsApp today about the upcoming schedule. Have a wonderful day. Yashikayach for joining. Stay safe and well. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yashikayach.
Chumash in 1 minute.
Thank you.
Hope to.